Welcome to the fourth edition of the Xpansiv webinar series. My name is Rene Velasquez. I lead the global carbon team at Xpansiv Markets CBL. And today I'm delighted to be moderating a panel which will surely prove to be a riveting conversation with global aviation experts as we discuss the industry's decarbonisation pathway. A few housekeeping remarks before we get underway. Given the webinar format and due to the high number of registrations, all attendees are muted by default. We do, however, encourage you to interact with us and address your questions by posting in the aptly named question section featured in your Zoom webinar panel. The organisers will be moderating your questions throughout the event, and we will, of course, do our best to address as many of them as possible. Please note that this event is being recorded and the link to the recording will be made available shortly after the event. So let's begin. Aviation as an industry is fundamental to the global economy. The industry supports $3.5 trillion, equivalent to roughly 4% of the world's gross domestic product. If aviation were a country, it would rank 17th in size by GDP. Air transport facilitates international trade, particularly for valuables and perishable goods. Interestingly, over a third of world trade by value travels by air. Now, during the COVID pandemic, the industry was adversely affected, a fact that has been well documented across all regions and across all media. After 2 very difficult years, however, I'm happy to say that the industry is entering a recovery phase, with many of us once again choosing to travel for pleasure, to see business colleagues, and especially to see loved ones. As the world reopens, the aviation industry is once again reminding us of the important role it plays in connecting us, because after all, it is the business of connection. Within the context of today's discussion, it is also important to point out that aviation is one of the hardest to decarbonize sectors. This is due in large part to the long lifespan of the airplanes, as well as the industry's dependence on hydrocarbons. And it's quite understandable because such dependency is based, quite frankly, on physics, as liquid jet fuel offers the energy density required to generate not only sufficient thrust to achieve the lift required for an aircraft, but also to sustain long journeys. It is also important to note that it is one of the most efficient forms of transport, especially for long haul and long distances. Now, to contextualize it within the scope of global emissions, global aviation in 2019 produced a little under 1 billion tons of CO2 emissions, accounting for almost 3% of global emissions. Now, as the sector recovers, however, it is focused on doing so with a focus, I should say, on decarbonisation. And now this decarbonisation pathway really has 4 main pillars, including technological efficiency, so think lighter aircraft, more efficient aircraft. 2, operating efficiency, so think things like e-taxiing and better air traffic management. And then 3, sustainable aviation fuels, or SAF. And then 4, market-based measures, such as eligible emission units or carbon credits. Today, we'll navigate this decarbonisation hierarchy and pathway for this fascinating sector and hear from global experts. And with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists to kick off today's conversation. Joining me today, Michael Schneider, Assistant Director for the Environment at IATA, Rohini Sengupta, Senior Manager, Environment, Sustainability and Climate at United Airlines, Heather Sheffer, Sustainability Policy Lead at Boeing. Thank you all so much for joining me today. Really appreciate the time. So let's kick off today's conversation. In my introduction, I mentioned the industry recovery following the COVID pandemic. So Michael, if I could, I'd like to just turn to you first, if possible, so that you could take us through really this recovery sort of within the last year. And obviously the COVID pandemic represented one of, if not the most difficult periods for the industry in living memory. And so my question to you is, in 2022, how do you see the recovery shaping up within the context of also the industry's net zero ambitions? So Michael, over to you.
Thank you, Rene. Thank you very much for the great introduction. It's great to reconnect with you and the rest. And of course, I think this is an excellent topic to sort of set the scene and understand really where we're coming from and where we're heading. And of course, everyone was affected by COVID, friends, families, everyone that wanted to travel. So it was not only a difficult time for aviation, but for everyone here, probably on this call. And it's really unprecedented. I mean, of course, aviation had seen instances where traffic was disturbed, but not to that extent. So basically, passenger traffic came nearly to a halt. And really, airlines suffered in the COVID travel restrictions, which were, of course, very differently interpreted depending on the country. And what we could see in 2020 and 2021 was really, I would say, a patchy rebound in demand. And that was really attributed to the fact that the restrictions were still in place. And again, they were quite differently interpreted or enforced, depending on which part of the globe you were basically based. And what we could see is really, after the initial hit of the crisis and following this, that we could see really domestic passenger market were really first to rebound. And that was really due to the fact that domestic travel obviously faces fewer restrictions or constraints and uncertainties than international travel. Because in the end, nobody wants to be stranded in another country. And the risk of taking a flight was simply too great for many. But what we look at also at the two biggest aviation markets, it's really US and also China. We could see that the inbound travel was allowed much earlier than for the rest of the world, which actually helped really with a strong recovery in the global numbers. But still, what we could see, there were very uncoordinated travel restrictions across regions. And that really caused international travel, the international travel to lack in recovery. And what became quite evident was the strong increase in demand for foreign travel has accelerated the recovery in this area. As soon as the restrictions on the travel were lifted, we could see immediately people wanted to fly, wanted to meet friends, families. And that was really the moment for everyone. Yes, now we have the opportunity to travel. So we have here a slide, and maybe you can share some numbers. In terms of when you compare with pre-COVID, we're still actually 30% below when we look at PAX numbers. So we're still quite a little bit off from when we compare to the pre-COVID situation. In terms of revenue passenger kilometers, which is sort of the yardstick for us, we're 35% still in rejections. But the good news is here that globally the air passenger demand continues its recovery. So the revenue passenger kilometers in rising, and if you compare year-on-year terms, I mean, 76% increase. So it's a huge increase if you compare year-on-year. Another interesting measure or metric that is of course important for airlines is not only how many flights you operate, but the load factor. And load factor is important, obviously, for the revenue bottom line. And here we're now at 82.4. So anything that's above 80% usually is a good indication. So since 2020, since January 2020, or pre-COVID basically, we're finally above 80% now. So what we're now looking forward is to see the reopening of the Asia Pacific market. So we strongly believe that will give another push to the global recovery, while of course the whole situation, inflation, interest rates, high interest rates, the war in Ukraine, all this has an impact on air travel. But still, the reopening of Asia Pacific is really important. So what does that really mean for the industry moving forward for this topic here that we are trying to discuss? Because obviously traffic and those things are linked to an environmental impact. So our emissions are going to increase. So if we look at this sort of until 2050, and there's this net zero commitment that we have made as the aviation sector, and all of our members have committed, some airlines even earlier, before 2050. I need to point that out. But as a sector, we have agreed on that. So what does it mean between now and 2050 in terms of emissions or just simply passengers? So we have 2 billion passengers now annually. We're going to go up to 10 billion passengers by 2050. So that gives you a little bit of a perspective. And Rene, I don't know if you have that slide, and that really looks at the sort of the different measures that would help us to abate emissions. So we have 21 gigatons of CO2, a huge amount of emissions that, thank you, Rene, that we need to abate. And obviously today, this is a good opportunity to discuss with airlines and providers and those that are part of the aviation ecosystem to understand how we're going to basically abate 21 gigaton of CO2. 1.5 trillion according to our analysis in abatement costs. And here you see, actually, before I hand over back to my esteemed colleagues here you see really the different levers that are going to help us to achieve this. And when we look at the 65% sustainable aviation fuels, of course, this is really one of the key levers that we need to scale up, make it affordable. And there's different ways of doing this, and we're going to be hearing about this today. And then, of course, there's other measures and other levers that most of you have probably seen in some form and shape and chart. So we have, of course, the operational improvements that airlines on a daily basis living and working on and putting a lot of effort in. But there's also then technical or other improvements in terms of air navigation system provider. There's next gen in the US, there's single European sky that needs to be implemented. It could immediately decrease emissions by nearly 20%, at least in Europe here, if we get the single European sky working. And then, of course, the orange wedge that you see, the 19%, those are really the residual emissions that we are most likely not going to be able to reduce in sector. So according to analysis, this will be have to be offset or by different means. It can be carbon offsets, CORSIA eligible credits, or carbon removals. So, and we can maybe talk about this later, but the impact of ICAO, CORSIA, and what that really means for the industry. But for now, I think that gives maybe a good overview of where we're standing and where we're heading. And I'm looking forward to have a discussion with my colleagues here on this panel. Back to you, Rene.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Michael. That's fantastic introduction and obviously really great context to understand the impact of COVID on the industry and then seeing now the recovery take place. You also kind of highlighted here, especially on the 4 pillars that I mentioned in the introduction, around those 4 key areas that the industry is leaning on in order to address this decarbonisation objective. So maybe I'll focus on the one in blue here on the screen, right? So I might turn to Rohini first. So Rohini, really, you're one of the most the world's foremost experts, shall we say, on sustainable aviation fuels. And so I'd really like to get your input really in terms of what you're seeing with regards to positive trends currently, and also so today, and then also what you're seeing within the next sort of 10 years shaping up in terms of the sustainable aviation fuel market and the feedstocks achieving scale. Can you provide us just some context, please?
Sure. Thank you, Rene, and thank you for the invitation to come speak today. And I'll echo everything Michael said in his introduction, specifically around sort of the need to look responsibly as we recover from this incredibly impactful, I would say, restriction of our services over the last few years, and what it's afforded airlines like United, but really airlines around the world, an opportunity to do is say, okay, as we grow, as we recover, how do we do so responsibly? So I think that's first and foremost a collective view and bedrock that has really spurred the increase momentum in SAF scale. So within the US, in 2021, 5 million gallons of sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, was used. The goal for the US government and airlines together is by 2030, 3 billion gallons of SAF will be available in the market. So as you can see, as you can observe, there are several orders of magnitude of scale that we need to answer for just within the US. But I think what is interesting and what is creating a demand signal that is really promising is policy in general. So as a US carrier, certainly in America, we have an incentive-based approach toward scaling renewable technologies, particularly SAF. And I know that is different in different regions, particularly with Europe looking and focusing more on mandates. But I think the the crux or the impetus behind this is common, which is that recognizing the market itself and airlines itself cannot accelerate or scale the SAF supply in the market today rapidly enough to meet some of these ambitious goals. So what we're seeing are policymakers and policy packages that are incentivizing SAF in the US. Just about, I think 1 month ago, the Inflation Reduction Act was passed in the US Congress. And I will tell you, frankly, a week prior to that, no one in the industry thought that there was really a roadmap for any SAF specific legislation. So the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, what it has offered is the first ever SAF specific federal incentive. And that's huge, right? Is it going to remove all roadblocks and cost barriers to SAF? No, but is it a huge step in the right direction? It absolutely is. And when you couple that with the interest of airlines increasing, commitments that airlines are making specific to SAF and in-sector reductions, as well as the federal government's goals around SAF specifically and decarbonizing aviation specifically, we are seeing a trend and an increase. And so we've been following the market for some time now, and we've been investing in sustainable aviation fuel for some time now. And just even seeing the rhetoric around investment in these projects, because these projects need to get off the ground. We need shovels in the ground, frankly. These projects growing is tremendous. And I think that that's really the positive sign. In terms of feedstock, today, what is available may not answer for all of aviation's needs in the future. So today we have sustainable aviation fuel that's made out of fats, oils, and greases. There's not enough supply of that particular feedstock category to answer for that 65% that was shown in the pie chart earlier. So the way that we're approaching it is, let's make sure we're investing in sustainable aviation fuel today. Let's understand the market drivers, but how do we also invest in technologies that need to scale over the next 5, 10, 15 years to answer for some of those shortages and constraints that will eventually come online. 5 million gallons today, you can argue you have your pick of the litter in terms of what type of feedstock, what type of pathway, and there are some that are more economically sound in the near term, but we have to invest to try to create economies of scale for further evolved SAF pathways to commercialize and come online.
And that's great. So obviously you've just highlighted two really important points, right? The policy uplift, if you'll indulge me on a dad joke, right? Needing that tailwind again. Sorry, I'm very punny today. Of the policy side of things, and then also the achieving the scale side. So there's a technological sort of barrier to entry. So maybe that's a good transition to include Heather on the conversation. So Heather, obviously you're representing Boeing, which is one of the largest original equipment manufacturers or OEMs worldwide, and really, obviously, dropping in SAF fuels to help to curb emissions is one thing, but the technology also needs to be sort of keeping up with that kind of transition and shift. Can you provide us just I think, your perspective in terms of what are the challenges, but also the solutions that Boeing is working on as the industry is transitioning to this net zero future?
Yeah, I'd love to. And Rene, thank you for the invitation for us to join you, and the likes of being able to cross paths again with the experts of Michael and Rohini on this topic. So it's a very important discussion, obviously extremely critical for our industry and the planet. I also think we're in an incredibly, maybe fun is not the right word, but a very exciting time to be a part, to talk about that we get to be a part of the solutions. So you know, it's hard to follow Michael and Rohini when they've talked and set up this so well, as did you, Rene. But you know, when we talk about the challenges and from an OEM's perspective, you know, 3 immediately come to mind, and I think the last one I'll list will be a transition into some of the solutions we get to talk about. Is one is, as an industry, the reliance on a global effort. Like, it is not just one person, one sector that can do this. And that is an immense undertaking and coordination. And I think, likely speaking to the choir here, the different global frameworks, policies, regulations, approaches, makes it challenging. And we have to overcome that. And I think there's really great signs and bright lights of that happening. But we have to pay attention to that, and we have to work through that. We're also going to have a reliance on out of sector as well. And obviously, offsets is one that immediately comes to mind, and likely for this audience, and supporting that industry. And I can talk a little bit about how we see our role in helping to support that, the standing up and the continuation of a robust and quality offsetting market, because we will need that as an industry. And then lastly, the other challenge really specific to us and OEMs is our replacement or product replacement and renewable timeline is vast compared to, it's not like the iPhone that comes out, classic example, but the iPhone that comes out every year, we look at, 10, 15, 20 years for any new substantial product replacement. So I think when we talk about what we're doing, it's everything that kind of happens in between the product that is important in the solution. So obviously, while our products are, it's on us to design and build more efficient aircraft, and doing that with lighter materials, incorporating the newest technology, be very forward and future looking. So when that aircraft comes off the line, it is the most cutting edge as possible, and that's how we achieve those 15 to 25% emission reductions with the new generation aircraft. I won't say that's the easy stuff, but that's one of our biggest area that we can make a difference. But it's all that in between time that is really important, and we really see our role in that as well. And that's everything from actively supporting and advocating many of the things that Michael and Rohini were already talking about in the international aviation sector, of the long-term aspirational goals, supporting the net zero 2050, standing up and supporting the SAF market. Both, can we invest getting those shovels in the ground? Can we partner ourselves? Can we support other partners and infrastructures for SAF to get that going? We also, operational efficiencies are a large one that we can support. So digital tools and data, everything from more efficient flight plans, live in-air weather tracking and support, those types of technological efficiencies and how the products are operated can help us save or reduce up to 10% of fuel burn and emissions. So that technological data aspect, continue to develop that and offer that, with our products to our customers, as well as our ability to recycle the product, build more responsibly, and be able to, at end of life, recycle and reuse as much of the product as well. Working on those advancements between products. And I think maybe the last two, or maybe two or three that I'll highlight is the passenger to freighter programs. So extending the life of aircraft and their usefulness and their stage is also an emissions savings and material savings as well. So supporting our customers to make that transition. And then being able to increase the number of midlife upgrades. So let's not wait until that, that very new product comes out, but what can we do midlife with the product to improve its efficiency, helping our customers make those changes and incorporating them in an efficient manner, so they get their aircraft in, out, and continue using them, but with better technology on them. And then I think the last one, I think we'll be talking about SAF and more, so I'll just skip to the offsetting. Rene, as we see that out of sector offsets are going to be critical in that, helping bridge some of those gaps as we reduce, find more efficient means that we still need offsetting to support. And so Boeing sees our role as helping stand up, continuing to stand up that market, being an investor in carefully selected quality offsets and supporting those projects, both for our own emissions, but we also see that it's important for the industry. And so we do that with the likes of the Aviation Carbon Exchange and being parts in providing consultation and supporting the development of standards and criteria for offsets as well. So we see a role for aviation at the table in those spaces as well.
Great, thanks, Heather. I mean, that was really comprehensive, and I think it just shows the breadth of the complexity of the issue at hand, right? We've touched on, obviously, the technological efficiency piece that you just kind of mentioned now, and obviously broader policy context that Rohini was mentioning around supporting SAF and the deployment of that and achieving the scale. But effectively, you just highlighted this this other kind of key component, the market-based measures piece, and obviously that's a subject close to our hearts, really, as a marketplace. How do you guys see, and this is a question for all of you, right? What do you see the current state of the capacity within the aviation industry so far in 2022? In terms of understanding the complexity also of carbon markets? I mean, you mentioned, Heather, around the selection of high quality offsets, but how do you see your peers or your customers in the case of Boeing kind of being able to address those needs right now, whether voluntary or for compliance purposes?
Yeah, I think there's lots of different ways we could that we can answer that. If I had to, just pick one thing to pick on that, and Michael and Rohini can look at that, is ensuring adequate volume of high quality, and that is, what we are. If we had a concern, and I'll say a lowercase c there, is we want to ensure that, and that is through the knowing our reliance on offsets for this sector, is that if we lose any of that robustness, any of the credibility, that's going to be a real chink in our armor and our ability to meet our goals if those are not considered trustworthy. And so for us, it's investment in ensuring, either bilateral agreements with projects to ensure that projects are making it to the marketplace and that we're supporting those efforts, and then being involved wherever we can on the standards and criteria and quality setting to make sure that the likes of operators, have that access moving forward too. And I'm sure Michael and Rohini, I don't want to speak too much on it because there's lots of other angles we could talk to on this.
Yeah, so but let's pivot to Michael. Michael, I mean, obviously you sit from a really interesting vantage point in terms of representing your members, which are the airlines, and obviously you're liaising with them on a regular basis around all of the topics that we mentioned today. But around the offsetting piece, how do you see the capacity and understanding and preparation for compliance shaping up right now?
Yeah, I would say it's really a mixed basket. We see, of course, some airlines that have some years of experience. You could say they have even their own carbon trading desks. They have experience. Most airlines have experience with fuel hedging and procuring fuel, but maybe not necessarily with carbon offsets. It's a different type of animal. Often it's not even clear within the organization who's actually taking charge of this. It could be fuel, it could be procurement, it could be finance, it could be treasury. Often that's actually the first question airlines asking themselves. So who's going to be doing this? Yeah, who has the expertise? Of course, IATA, we provide usually support mechanism, and especially when it comes to CORSIA, there's a number of support mechanisms that we would provide airlines, whether it's the MRV, the reporting aspects, or here the ACE, for example, is a mechanism amongst other mechanisms that exist. But that's just one mechanism that would help airlines to get to know carbon markets. But generally, since the carbon market is a little bit opaque for most of the new entrants, for the new kids on the block, I would say, they need help, they need assistance. And I think the carbon market has to evolve here as well to adapt also to the needs of airlines. Of course, now we have the CORSIA eligible emission units. We start to compete with other sectors over the same units. That puts pressure on demand and supply. That can have an impact on the price. All those things airlines need to learn about. And I think we all need to play a role in this to bring them up to speed with this. And I think the system and tools, and obviously the ACE is one of the mechanisms that really can help airlines to understand. And capacity building is really, I think, the key here.
Yeah, I completely agree. Thanks, Michael. I mean, the capacity building piece is obviously critical in terms of the preparation for the carbon markets piece. If there's a couple of things that I'd like to unpack, if you'll indulge me. Heather, you mentioned a couple, but maybe I'll circle back to the long-term global aspirational goal, or LTAG, in a minute. But since we're talking about offsets, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't address really the elephant in the room, and that's around the eligible emission units under CORSIA for eligibility. And so, Michael, I'm going to kind of kick this back to you, and I'll also share a slide that you kindly provided me just to kind of help to illustrate this for the audience. But effectively, originally ICAO has set the baseline for CORSIA compliance as the average of 2019 and 2020 emissions. But obviously, during the pandemic in 2020, the industry was in turmoil, and the industry membership, so IATA and a number of airlines and obviously member states lobbied ICAO, and the baseline was adjusted to include only the 2019 levels. That makes sense. But obviously it's had the effect around muting effectively the demand for CORSIA compliant units from airlines, given that effectively, and in the earlier slide you mentioned this, that the emissions really haven't yet exceeded the 2019 baseline. So the question now, Michael, for you is, from my understanding, ICAO is currently discussing 4 scenarios to either adjust or maintain the current baseline. Can you please describe these scenarios for our audience? And I'll also just share the slide that you've provided to provide some context there.
Yeah, thank you, Rene. Indeed, the baseline is really a topic that is a hot topic right now, and we, of course, are part of the discussions. And maybe to understand really the context, because I'm kind of conscious that not everyone maybe who tuned in today is fully aware how we developed the 2019-2020 average. Because when the discussion started around 2013, I think everyone agreed that in order to absorb a shock that could happen during a given year, we would basically take 2 years and take the average. And we had seen volcano ash and all those things that had maybe an impact of a week or 2 weeks, mainly in Europe. Traffic was affected, but not something like COVID that basically stopped entirely aviation, or almost brought us to a halt. So that was, of course, not anyone had foreseen. And here had, I'm sorry, hence the need to adapt the baseline to 2019. So what we could see now in recent months is there's a growing momentum here at the ICAO Council level, and it's really the party that takes this forward to an assembly potentially, to a change using, again, going back to the 2019 and 2020 emissions, the average. And that was really triggered primarily the number of states that's seeking a higher level of ambition, you could call it, for offsetting requirements. And in particular, it was really states in Europe and the US that were concerned that we don't see really yet an offset requirement. So, I apologize. Based on this background, so ICAO actually invited IATA to present an analysis. And we really presented the problematic nature of including 2020 emission in the CORSIA baseline. And what we realized is that due to the stringent COVID restrictions, of which none of the carriers had any impact, because those were government restrictions and airlines would be falling. And in some countries, they were more restrictive than others. The lower the individual carrier's baseline would be, that would obviously result in higher requirements. So we showed some analysis that indicated an increase of more than $14 billion if we basically switch back to the initial 2019-2020 baseline. And some individual carriers would be affected close to $1 billion in difference in costs. So basically, we see here the 4 options that really were brought forward to the ICAO Council and the ICAO CAPE analysis. And you see option 1 is really our position. So we maintain our position of 2019 emissions due to the COVID situation, which represents a compliance cost of close to $15 billion. We see the option 2, which is kind of a scenario between an offsetting scenario between, or an ambition between 1 and 4, that will likely trigger offsetting requirements from 2024, which would then represent a total compliance cost of around $28 billion for IATA members. Then we have the option 3, basically 70% of 2019 emission. And that is really a proxy actually for what very similar to the overall offsetting that would be achieved by using the 2019-2020 baseline, average baseline. And here the bill would go up to $42 billion. So that's of course significant. And then the average 2019-2020 initial design element of CORSIA, which is a bill of $44.2 billion. So what basically happened, to cut a long story short, here we see some impact also on European level to carriers based in different parts of the world. And you see there's quite some differences depending on where you're based, and the growth of aviation that's going to be happening between now and 2050. I think it's quite telling. But in the end, what the ICAO Council member states agreed is to have a compromise proposal on the CORSIA periodic review, which is basically now that let's give you put forward to the Assembly, the CORSIA baseline of 85% of 2019 emissions from 2024 to 2035, during the duration basically of CORSIA. And then there's an element of sectoral growth factor versus individual growth factor, which I'm not going to go into now because that's becoming maybe a little bit too technical, but
probably too technical. Yep.
Yeah. But the compromise proposal really represents a compliance cost of approximately $27 billion for the industry, basically. So that sort of sets the scene. So we need to see how this pans out. Of course, we're expecting more reaction. I think generally there seems to be support from ICAO member states. I think there's only 2 countries that have strong reservations. It's China and Russia. And here I think the proposal was from those countries that the states themselves should decide what the baseline is, basically. So that's on the national sovereignty of those countries. So, and this is where we're standing now, and we need to see what is going to be happening. Obviously, if this proposal goes through, this will have an impact on the carbon market. So let me stop here.
Yeah.
And Rene.
Yeah, please, Heather, jump in.
Do you mind if I jump in?
Yeah, of course.
Just to add a little bit to Michael, because I think he touched on some good points. Is just what I think I'll highlight as a good or a bright spot in this is that there were, I think everyone going in was a little bit, to the council meeting, even coming out of the high level meeting on ATAG is a bit apprehensive, not exactly sure how things were going to fall out. And there was a lot of intense negotiation, both in what we were able to observe, and we also know, just those backroom negotiations as well. But I think the kind of the good news story out of this is that, from what I'm hearing, this has been one of the cleanest resolutions in terms of time invested in trying to find an agreement, and I think that points to a global understanding of the need to coordinate and move on something in a unified manner, and that is also fairly strong and robust in terms of perhaps not the perfect outcome depending on where you're standing, but the 85% of 2019. The old adage, if everyone hurts a little, we're probably finding a good policy, and I think that was. I think we're going into the 41st General Assembly as an industry seeking aspirational goals in a very strong position.
Great. So you highlighted a couple of things that then I'd like for you to unpack, Heather, if you'll indulge me. So the first is, you mentioned really this spirit of collaboration that exists within the aviation industry, right? You kind of described it as this kind of shared kind of collective pain component, but it also relates to the increase in ambition, right? And also, let's just point out the obvious here for the audience, but the aviation industry is the only sector that has a global commitment and a system to address its emissions, right? And that is one of the key drivers, was in order to avoid a patchwork quilt of different regional and national type of systems. So that's the first point. But now the question is around this global aspirational, long-term global aspirational goal, or LTAG. And you've mentioned that twice, I think, so far within your comments, Heather. So maybe I can go to you, and can you provide us just an overview, really, in terms of what is the LTAG, specifically also what is the importance of reaching this agreement? I think you touched on it, and then kind of the current status and what are the next steps, sort of thing.
Yeah, so for the long-term aspirational goal, will be or what we're expecting to come out of the ICAO's 41st General Assembly is an industry commitment to net zero by 2050. We have seen that by other industry stakeholders, but this will be our global community making that statement, and so that's huge. That's significant. There's a number of factors that Rohini and Michael, really that pie chart that Michael had up are, those are the levers that make up how we're going to achieve the long-term aspirational goal for aviation. And, going into the General Assembly, or I should say, I will back up that those that have, thank you for pulling that up, but, that pie chart is what represents the primary initiatives that we'll be working on as an industry to achieve that 2050 goal. And so you can imagine all of the nitty gritty. We could have a whole nother hour on the steps that are in all the working papers for each one of these segments of how we're going to make it, but that we have the commitment to do so globally is really what's going into the General Assembly, and I'd say, don't want to speak for everyone, but I think we're hopeful that that's what we're going to come out of, that second week of October. And I do want to, not to toss the ball at Rohini, but you made a really important point about with the IRA, all of a sudden there's this potential kind of roadmap where we see opportunities to move SAF forward. And I think we also see that in the working papers for LTAG, is the inclusion of SAF, the global commitment to work on those details, share learnings, and then also investment in sustainable aviation fuel as well. And maybe a question and a statement, but I think that will also add to the momentum that you, Rohini, that you were talking about right now.
Rohini, over to you. Can you provide some comments on that piece? Thanks, Heather, for setting that up.
Happy to. Yeah, I think that, look, SAF is the way we're going to achieve in-sector reductions. That is the long and short of it. It is, we don't have any other energy carrier that is dense enough to address long-haul travel. At United, 70% of my emissions is from medium and long-haul travel. So while as United, I have invested in hydrogen fuel cell aircraft and in battery electric aircraft, those at max right now, I'm looking at 50 seaters, and that's not going to address me getting to Rene in Singapore, right? So how do I look at decarbonizing my footprint? It's definitely purchasing the most efficient aircraft, and it is definitely flying in the most efficient way, but 98% of my emissions is from jet fuel, and it will continue to be from liquid jet fuel. So how do I decarbonize that liquid jet fuel? So SAF is our key focus. And it's increasingly becoming the focus area for, as Heather was saying, within ICAO, it's becoming an increasing focus area within the administration here in the US. And obviously with packages like Fit for 55 in the EU, the RED II program, it's increasingly becoming the focus area across the pond. So it is really a matter of looking at the crux of scaling sustainable aviation fuel. And the adage is that the first 10% is just as hard as the last 90%. And that's really where we are today. And the we've been talking about SAF for a long time. I will tell you, every single day I recognize I go to events like the IATA Energy Forum now that is far more a discussion around SAF and how to scale SAF than it has ever been in the past, right? And that's because this is such a key issue for airlines at the very top leadership level. You're seeing entire teams, you're seeing ventures organizations, or CVC funds that are focused on technologies to really address this issue, which is how do we continue to provide the valuable service that Rene talked about in the beginning without unduly prohibiting it to low-cost areas that we're able to finally provide aviation toward today by increasing cost of aviation due to cost pass-through from SAF, right? SAF today is at a premium to conventional jet fuel, and there are a lot of reasons for that, and that is its own hour, frankly. But in general, the important thing is to figure out how to get these projects off the ground. And I did see a question in the audience about sort of the limited effects, let's say, of the IRA and the SAF production today. And it starts off, there's only a single SAF plant producing commercially today. There's actually no dedicated SAF plant producing commercially today. I want to be really clear. There are renewable diesel facilities that have a portion of their yield allocated to a sustainable aviation fuel. So you're not only competing with conventional jet fuel, you're competing with renewable diesel, you're competing with the renewable fuels market. So I think what's really important to understand is, how do you create economic drivers for producers that have access to feedstock to pivot or increase the yield of their production towards sustainable aviation fuel? That is the most near-term question we need to solve for. The next question you need to answer and solve for is, how do you move away from fats, oils, and greases, which have limited life cycle reductions and have significantly limited supply? You've got maybe 1.7 billion gallons just of fogs if all of it went to sustainable aviation fuel today. How do you take that and say, okay, what about biomass? What about municipal solid waste? What about feedstock that we have in abundant supply? What is the mechanism to convert that feedstock to sustainable aviation fuel? And there are different economic drivers for those two different sort of feedstock pathway combinations. So it's so important that not only is everyone involved, but everyone is looking at every single sort of evolution of the SAF market scale progression. It is taking what's available today and trying to get as many gallons or liters, for many of you, of SAF out of it. But then also, how do I invest in facilities that will take biomass, that will take, fuel crop, that will take municipal solid waste, and eventually that will take captured carbon and hydrogen? How do we create the roadmap for those so it doesn't take just as long as it took these current SAF suppliers to come to market, because we don't have that time? And I think that's really the key piece. And the IRA kicks that off. It really does, because what it does is say, what used to be $1 SAF premium to $2 renewable diesel premium, now in some cases is $1.75 to $2. It's not parity, but it's getting closer. And I think that it's not just a matter of what is the cost relative to jet fuel for the airlines, it's also what is the cost of production relative to renewable diesel for the producers. And those are equally important questions that will scale the supply of SAF in the market.
And that's great. And I think you're right. We could delve into this topic for an hour for itself. I'm just conscious of time, and obviously, Rohini, thank you for also answering a number of the questions in the Q&A directly, whilst the rest of us have been speaking, and then also just addressing a number of them also just with your intervention just there. There's a question from Maximilian around essentially the role of energy companies and how the bilateral agreements between those energy companies and the airlines is essentially creating healthy competition for the development of SAF in terms of scaling this. I think you mentioned the conference in Munich, the IATA Energy Conference, and the kind of the healthy view and optimism at that event around a lot of the large majors really helping to kind of invest significant sums of money into this space. Rohini, and also Heather and Michael, are open to any of you for intervention. What do you see sort of, you know, their role of these energy companies in this space?
Yeah, I'll start, but please, Michael, Heather, jump in. You know, I think for the way I see it is there are certainly kind of varying sizes and pedigree of SAF producers. And by SAF producer, I mean somebody who has, you know, some engineering process flow diagrams put together and says, I'm going to make SAF at the end of the day, you know, and over a beer someday, I'm happy to kind of opine on that variety and breadth of options.
I'll pick up on that.
Yes, that's an open to everyone. But what I will say is that the involvement of an integrated energy company, or, you know, somebody who understands what it takes to get jet fuel into the airport, is a lot of these companies are very familiar with large projects, you know, billion-dollar capex, returns that are dependent on, you know, product crack spreads, things like that. They understand the market and they understand longevity. So they might be the ones with the foresight to really kind of play out the EV adoption and pivot to aviation fuels in a way that at a project level, that's not necessarily oversight that's available. And the airlines are trying to understand that more, but is a little bit out of our competency and wheelhouse. So I think that there's a lot of, you know, we invested in Fulcrum Bioenergy, for example, so did BP. And in a lot of ways, a lot of the learnings and just getting the first demo plant up and running, it's helpful to have somebody who's built a million things that are similar, you know, and have that awareness and understanding and that sort of stewardship of capital and execution of design available. And then the second thing I'll say is that it is not easy to get fuel into an airport. One thing that maybe not everyone appreciates is that SAF today needs to be blended. Mm-hmm. So you can at maximum have 50% neat sustainable aviation fuel, but you have to blend it with conventional jet fuel. Many SAF producers are really good at their technology, are understanding how to build that first or second plant, or maybe even nth plant. But what they don't and shouldn't have to do is become conventional jet fuel traders, purchasing jet fuel, blending, testing, transporting. It is logistically, it is out of scope for a SAF producer, I believe. And so where an integrated energy company can come in is where they always have, which is to provide logistics to get jet fuel to the airport. And at the end of the day, all they're doing is taking the neat SAF that a producer has made and blending it and putting it in their pipeline as they always have. And they can tolerate a lot of the risk that some of these boutique SAF producers cannot. So I think there is really a role for the established infrastructure of fuel today, while encouraging new entrants with new ideas and sustainable technologies to enter the market.
Heather, I see you nodding vigorously.
Oh yeah, I don't think I could really add anything other than just getting excited about what Rohini is saying. It's you know, when it comes to energy majors, you know, as she mentioned, even when we are investing, we find ourselves investing with other energy majors as well. BP, Shell, you know, we all know the list, are brought into the same room. And I really think of it not so much as a SAF, you know, an us, them, right? There is a wealth of expertise in that market that we actually need. I think probably answering similar to one of the questions that came up is, how do we do this? And it's kind of, we need to take any resource that we can, and energy majors do offer a wealth of experience. The infrastructure thing is absolutely critical, right? We have SAF producers, but it is not necessarily in their wheelhouse. And one might argue we don't want it to be. If we have infrastructure already in place and we have those pathways already in existence, let's use those as well. So they are absolutely a important resource and voice at the table because of that expertise. And you know, it is going to take a wide variety and a large volume of investment as well. So I think it's going to take a little bit of everything to get to zero, and that means everybody as well.
Rene, can I just add?
Yeah, please, Michael. I'd love
to
to see
few
you.
more sentences,
Yep,
and I
please.
totally agree with both speakers before. Clearly, some challenges that those parties can help us to overcome. But when one thing came out of the Energy Forum was the ability to make an investment and to make a claim, and the need for a globally accepted accounting framework and global book and claim that is accepted and endorsed by governments, fully embedded under CORSIA and other regulatory schemes. And that's something, I mean, there have been some great initiatives where fuel producers also been taking part, large corporates have been taking part, and of course, airlines. I think the challenge will be to bring all those great initiatives together to have sort of an agreement eventually to have an approach that fits all of us. Because I can see that some of those initiatives, maybe they're geared on one hand maybe towards more corporates or more fuel producers, but in the end, airlines flying, using that SAF, burning the fuel, and they should be able to maintain that incentive. We need to maintain that incentive with the airlines because they're making large investments here. And I think that will be the challenge I see that needs to be addressed pretty quickly, pretty rapidly, actually.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Michael, around the book and claim piece. Rohini and Heather, do you want to chime in on that one? I'm just conscious of time. Maybe this will be the last question.
Yeah, I mean, I think credible accounting, as everybody can appreciate from whatever sector they work in, across kind of any of these exchanges, credible accounting and transparent accounting is so critical. I think in the written Q&A in the chat, I did reference our EcoSkies Alliance program, and that is where we facilitate corporate customers, as Michael was saying, purchasing our SAF, and it has allowed us to purchase quite a bit more SAF than we were able to previously, and hope to increase year over year. It's important that those customers have transparency in the reductions that are being attributed to them. So there is book and claim, but there's also just sort of this kind of scope transparency in user and passenger. And we will continue to sort of offer tools like various tools we actually have in our customer portal right now to really account for not only your emissions, but what the SAF reductions are associated with any SAF that you've purchased as a customer. So it is really critical. And I think that per usual, there are a couple of different conversations in different groups happening right now to work on this. So, I think that the important thing is that we come up with if it's a registry, if it's a book and claim guidance, whatever it is, but one that is adopted by enough members of the industry and enough sort of, agreed upon among environmental groups and so on, so that there is kind of a cross-sector agreement on the approach and transparency. And I would just say, stay tuned. There's a lot of work happening even this fall, particularly at certain sort of sustainability certification standard houses and things like that, to really get to the crux of this issue. And hopefully over the next several months, we can start being able to share some of the early learnings and draft guidances.
Great, thanks, Rohini. And I think we're sort of close to the end of the webinar. So first, I'd like to thank you all for your inputs. I think that was a riveting conversation. I'd also like to give you guys the floor for any final comments in case you wanted to add anything else that we may not have covered. So, Michael, did you want to say anything? Rohini, Heather?
No, I think what clearly comes out, I mean, collaboration is the key. So we need to collaborate. We need government support. I think the LTAC, the long-term aspirational goal, is super important for us. We see here the US having made very positive moves in the right direction. We want to see this elsewhere in Europe and other parts of the world. So the LTAC is really important to support the industry's commitment in the future. I mean, to achieve our commitment, basically. We need governments to follow and to push on their side.
Mm-hmm. Rohini, Heather, anything else you wanted to add?
I can't agree more. It's cross-sector, cross-public-private partnership. It is, it's everything and above. It is an awareness piece. I think that in terms of our options to reduce, it's high it's high impact, low visibility. The plane feels the same when you sit on it, whether it's powered by SAF or not.
Yeah.
And so it's a kind of go tell your best friend what SAF is, go tell your best friend the different options we have when they're flying. But also I think that's why it's so important. It's every individual person, but it is large groups rolling up their sleeves and writing checks also. And so proud to be one of those, but welcome partners in the journey that exist, but want to join as well. There's always room, particularly for development capital.
Thanks, Rohini. That's great. Heather?
Yeah, and I think I could, the best I could add is yes, yes, and yes to everything that's been said. To steal from our European friends and the concept of, a basket of measures. And I think what we really hit on here is there are so many things happening in this space. Each one needs to succeed in, in its unique way for its contribution. And I think we are sitting at an exciting time right now, especially this year with the General Assembly, the LTAC, CORSIA kind of getting really to move forward as we come out of the pandemic, and the exciting things with SAF. And I think, as Rohini said, in the next couple of months with book and claim and standards. So I think the stay tuned is probably a really perfect way to conclude too.
Great. No, thank you. Thank you so much. And really thank you all really for what was a riveting conversation. Honestly, I think we could have gone an extra hour if we had the time. Obviously conscious that we were a little bit over, but firstly also like to thank the audience for joining. We hope that you really enjoyed today's discussion. As we wrap, I also just thought that to share this slide here for those that are interested in learning more about this very topic. There's the Aviation Carbon event that's coming up on the 17th to 19th of October in London. It'll host the foremost experts in aviation over 3 days to discuss all of the aspects of the industry's decarbonization pathways. Xpansiv is the platinum sponsor, and we're very proud of that. And we've actually secured a 20% discount code, which is on the screen here. I'll also share that online. But feel free to register at the event, and hope to see you all there in person. And then, of course, please, like our panelists said, please tune in for the next webinar in October, and we'll have some more information around that. I think there'll be some direct lineage or correlation, let's just say, with regards to some of the topics that we talked about today. So with that, I'll close today's webinar and say thank you very, very much to the audience, but also very much to our panelists. So thanks so much for joining.